Good evening. I'm calling the Monday, May 8th, 2017 Planning Commission meeting to order. Will everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right, first item on the agenda tonight is the approval of tonight's agenda. Do I have any requested changes? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
Move to approve.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Agenda's approved. Next up is the approval of minutes from the last meeting held Monday, April 24th, 2017. Commissioner Wicke.
Mr. Chair, I have a couple of changes to make. Bottom of page 3, last sentence, what he stated the risk was on the developers. If we could change that to what he stated, it sounds there's more risk on the developers. And then one more when you're ready. And then bottom of page 4, I gotta find it here. Oh yes, last paragraph, what he stated again, his concern is the city's ordinances and other entities. Change that to what Keith stated again. His concern is with the other entities pushing for our ordinance changes. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Wicke. Anyone else? All right, hearing none, I'll entertain a motion for the minutes as amended.
So moved.
Do I have a second? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Right. Minutes as amended are approved. Moving on, we have a public hearing tonight. Hewler property, location 12300 River Road. This is a request for preliminary plat of one lot into 3 lots on 4.46 acres. Will the proponent of the project please come forward? Good evening.
Good evening.
If you could you state your name and spell it for the record, please?
Dan Blake, B-L-A-K-E, with the Pemtom Land Company. I've been before you as an applicant before. Today I'm a consultant working to help the Hewlers, Greg and Kelly, who are the property owners of this site. Greg and Kelly have owned this property for, I think, around 20-some years, and are trying to figure out what they might be able to do with a fair amount of land. So before you, I don't know how this works. I assume you see what's on those screens. But before you is just is an overview of the site. But we're going to back up a little bit and see how well this works for viewing. This is a 1937 picture, and I have to point, so I don't know. I'll just point over that way, and I don't know if my pointer will work well. But you obviously have the Minnesota River. There we are. I don't know. Can't point very well, but you guys can't point over there. Anyway, well, you'll figure it out. You have the Minnesota River at the south end. You've got kind of cutting diagonal across the property is Flying Cloud Drive, or was old 212. I think it's Flying Cloud Drive again. You can see Starring Lake up at the top. If you look really hard, you can see Pioneer Trail going across the property, kind of north-south. Just to the right of center is Homeward Hills, or the road in that same alignment. And then along the south, or just north of the river, you have Riverview Road, which at the time, in 1937, I believe went all the way from Town Line Road, which is now 169, to where it intersected into Flying Cloud Drive and made its way to Shakopee. I put this in here because I think it's a neat piece of history with this property, and since I can't point, but at the corner of Riverview Road, and I got another slide that zooms in, is this property and the house that's there today. So as we zoom in, same photo, right near that corner of the river, you can see where Riverview Road heading west, took a sharp left, and that is still the boundary of this property today. You can see in the middle, kind of that photo, that's the existing house. There's a barn, a little bit hard to see, but you can see some farm roads, and you can actually see some gardens on the north part of the property, which really are the current front yards of some Riverview Road residents. You can actually see the stand of pine trees or there at the very north edge that is it's right behind the curb out there today in the front yards of those houses. So, I was just, Mr. Hewler's here with us today, and I was just commenting, because I know when I wrote my notes down, the house was built in 1917, which, easy math, that was 100 years ago. We don't have that many Eden Prairie features that are 100 years old, and we're going to do our best to retain that with this proposal. So we move to more current conditions. Here's an aerial photo. Obviously you can see the house. This is a rough estimate of the property boundaries based on the roads that are out there. There's the house itself that's on the property, which again we propose to retain on one of the lots. There's the front of the house. It's a detached garage with a little guest room type above it. And there's the view from the Hewler's yard, which I'm not sure how far you could see, but from there it looks like you can see Mankato maybe, but probably not. Obviously the site is sloped, as you can see from the view. This is looking south, so the hill goes from north to the south. I think it meets most of the city definitions for steep slope. I find it, though, interesting that someone in 1900 or maybe before chose to build Riverview Road right down that hill, and it was a traveled way for many, many years. I don't think we could do that today, and obviously that road's not in use today. Wetland study was done, and there were no wetlands on the property. As you could see here and in the other pictures, there's a fairly heavy tree cover. It's a mixture of native oaks and cedars, a lot of planted trees around the homestead and such, the pines and spruce, and some other species. There's a 36-inch catalpa tree, which is not native to Eden Prairie. And there's a lot of buckthorn. If you walked the site, you would say it's very thick underbrush. It's pretty much it's buckthorn, and we have a lot of that in Eden Prairie. So we got a unique site. It's fairly large, but a lot of issues with how might one use it. A lot of things have been looked at in the past. I will tell you that since we've been working with the Hewlers, we explored a few different concepts, and I'm going to go through them very quickly. We looked at, what if you did 2 9-unit condo buildings? We believed there would be a significant market for that. It might fit well on the site, but decided it wasn't probably worth trying to work through a city process because it's just too inconsistent with the surroundings, even though it might be meet a need a little bit better to have some high-end condo kind of thing on the river bluff, but we didn't go that route. We also looked at what that looks like 7 villa-type homes that kind of all utilize the slope. We looked at, so this plan has 5 lots that we believe met all the code requirements for the R1 13.5. This plan had 4 lots that are a little bigger. This plan has 3 lots on the site and 1 lot just off property that the Hewlers also owned, and for reasons that, because it's outside the MUSA, was one of the reasons we didn't go with this plan, and we landed with the plan that's before you, which is 3 fairly large lots on 5.4 acres. We think this is the best balance between being sensitive to the site and the slope and the trees, and yet getting some utilization out of the property. The lots are 1.1 to 1.7 acres, so obviously 3 or 4 or 5 or more times larger than the adjacent lots. We have fairly large single family to the north of us. We have much smaller single family adjacent to the east. The density is about 0.7 units per acre compared to 2.5 units per acre that would be allowed normally in this zoning district. But the property is zoned R1 13.5. I think oftentimes properties that come before the commission are still zoned rural, and then we're talking about rezoning to something. This one already has the zoning, but our 3 lots meet all the requirements in the zoning district. This is a little bit more of a, we'll call it closer to a cartoon, but it's really the plan before you with some things highlighted. If you start sort of upper right is the existing house. And then south of that, or going down, is a proposed new house. To the left or the west of the existing house is another proposed new house. The one to the west on what I believe we call Lot 3 is where the old barn sat. So there's a natural clearing there. If you had a chance ever to go out there, you can actually drive your car not down the Hewler driveway, but where that other driveway is shown across the grass. It's flat enough, and there used to be a road that went back there to that barn. Working with staff, we kept making those we don't know what's going to get built. Obviously, it'll be a house designed for the site. There'll be large upscale houses, probably single level, therefore the footprints are big. Each time we propose something, staff said, you should make those footprints a little bigger, just make sure we're accounting for everything. And so those are probably oversized quite a bit for an actual house. And then if you look carefully on the plans, we show some dotted lines on where decks and pools might be, just to make sure that we were addressing how does it really fit on the slope, what trees are impacted. Most likely we're showing more than would really be there, but we think this is a reasonable, but probably a little bit overestimation of what actually be done in there. So as I said, retain the existing house as shown there. The access way to the existing house is the existing drive. We're trying to retain some flexibility on how the other driveways work, but we kind of have a vision that they might all come to a common point with some kind of either an actual gate or a thing that looks like a gate for 3 lots. We looked at least the idea of having that gate further up Riverview Road, and that's in city right away, and I, again, didn't think that was really something the city was going to feel comfortable with, so we show that common point coming off the Riverview right away into the site. So the road you see that's kind of running north-south is in an old or current, but city right away without an actual road there. You can drive down it. It's the Hewler driveway effectively now. We will be adding sewer and water to that location, so that road would get rebuilt and at least prettied up a little bit. Would still be more closer to a driveway than a road, but it'd be in that same alignment. Maintenance of all these driveways would be privately handled and done via some type of either association or cooperative, effectively a cooperative agreement between the 3 owners. And then we need easements across Lot 1 for the private utilities and the driveways themselves, and staff has spelled that out fairly carefully, and we're not, we understand that and are on board with that, but staff did mention that they asked us to look at doing some flag lots, and I don't disagree that it could be done. Kind of a question is which is neater. These are nice and neat lot shapes. We could do some long flags to get the driveways in and have less easements. We were trying to retain some flexibility and let the end users work out how do they want their driveways to work. Do they want their own driveway out to Riverview? Do they want a shared access through a gate kind of thing? So the way we have it laid out, there's some flexibility. Grades aren't really an issue, either configuration. So we've proposed an easement for the private driveways and the private utilities across Lot 1. Very bottom, there's a small stormwater management area. The contours on that map make it look like there's more ponding than there is. It's really a dry infiltration area. There's some contours kind of chasing up the slope to get it to work, but it would be a pretty small feature there to meet the runoff, all the stormwater management requires of the city and the watershed district. The staff report mentions a old foundation that's also down in that area. It looks like a little square that kind of crosses the right-of-way line. It's very close to this ponding area, but it's not in the ponding area, and it wouldn't be flooded if the pond was built as designed. We're collectively not sure what that is. I drove down there before someone told me it was a thing, and I didn't think it was a thing, but it maybe has a lot of history and it might be an important thing. We're not proposing to impact it. I guess the other thing you see on that site plan is there's a shaded area that meets the bluff definition. I think as a sort of a lay person's expectation, those other houses that were on Riverview Road were kind of at the top of the bluff because it was a flat and then a slope. But most of that slope doesn't actually meet the definition of bluff, but this small area down at the bottom does, and staff has asked that we put that in a conservation easement. And since it really has no impact on the home site, we certainly don't have a problem with that. Lastly, I guess I would comment that the staff report seemed to have a disproportionate amount of conditions. However, I even sent an email to staff saying, no surprises, kind of like those kind of reports. So there's a lot of things in there. Every one of them we had talked about ahead of time. Every one of them we are in agreement with. I think staff felt the need, since the timing of all this is a little uncertain when it will actually get constructed, staff felt the need to make sure we had clarity on the conditions. And now backtrack on to what I just said there. Different than a typical development where developer comes before you and says, this is our plan, we're going to go out and build it. The healer's intent here is to get a plan approved and then go market the lots. And when they have builders for the buyers and builders for the individual lots, that's what would trigger putting in the sewer and water, the stormwater management, and the actual final plat. If all goes well, that would happen soon. If it takes a long time, it would just be a little bit later. But I can't imagine it wouldn't be within the normal 2-year time frame for a preliminary plat. But all depends on how things go. We had a neighborhood meeting. We had very, very little attendance. We sent out an invitation to a lot of people, and we had a couple of people come, and they had kind of their own private lot question, which I think we easily answered. One of the questions that sort of gets talked about is, well, what's going to get built here? What's the price point? And all I can say is, I don't know, but you guys probably have as good an idea as I do. They'll be expensive houses. I can't really guess what the price point is, but we're seeing some pretty high numbers on Riverview kinds of lots, and these are large parcels with, very desirable conditions. So we'd expect to see some fairly good sized homes, but not inconsistent with the surrounding area. I mean, different than the villas adjacent us, but not inconsistent with other things on Riverview, or even that inconsistent with what's up on Riverview Road straight to the north of us. So all that said, I would be glad to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. Any initial questions from the commission? I have a question. Could you elaborate a little bit on a point I thought you made when you were showing us the picture of the overall property? One scheme had an additional lot to the west that you said that the Hewlers owned.
Well, Hewlers own the property to the west of the site that we're talking about.
They do?
It's 16 acres. It's outside the MUSA. It's mostly slope. It's almost all slope. And it's not part of this application because staff was very clear that it wasn't, there weren't any development rights or homes to be built there. And so this was just an idea of how something could get used there, but that's not part of the plan for today.
All right, thank you. And were you encouraged to, or did you have a neighborhood meeting?
We did have a neighborhood meeting, yes. We had 4 people.
4 people? Okay.
70 invitations, 4 people came.
Okay.
One guy made it clear he was there because they were playing bunco at his house and his wife needed him out of the house.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
I think we answered all the questions of the people that were there. There certainly weren't objections that were pointed out. I did get a couple of emails from people with what I'd call closer to real questions, and I hopefully did a good job answering their questions. We had a little dialogue with each of those people regarding how high are the roofs and what's happening with the existing house and things like that.
I have a question. Given this property has been developed for 100 years, at least this house, what about the house or the trees, the heritage trees on the property that are of particular significance that would require real sensitive management during any backhoe operation or grading operation? Because there's quite a bit of literature now on the impact of heavy construction on routes and how you manage that?
Well, I will do my best to answer, and then you'll defer to your staff probably anyway. But as it's shown, we're not impacting any of the heritage trees. Your staff does a good job of going out and look at them on the ground and telling us when we're cheating with our lines and saying, well, just because you're saying this one's not impacted, we disagree with you. So we think that there are no impacts to the heritage trees. There is a lot of flexibility with the houses and driveways in case someone got out in the field and said, well, this is closer to this tree than we thought. There's room, the way the plan is designed, to adjust things. And as I said, I think with a lot of confidence that we've got a big enough box shown for the houses and the potential pools and decks so that we shouldn't be encroaching into any heritage trees. At this point, we aren't proposing something specific for protection, but because of the steep slopes and because of the a little bit non-typical situation, staff, one of the staff conditions is that each lot has its own land alteration permit, which would then look at things like that again, because we couldn't describe exactly how the grading was going to work today. We showed it in a general manner, but until we have an actual house, we can't do that.
I have a question, Mr. Blake. This is for my own information. I like the way you've laid that out, knowing that the soil is sandy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how much of a drop is there? Would you estimate as far as in the steepness of it? How much is it dropping off? It's just a guess.
I don't know who's fastest with the contour over there. It's probably pushing 100 feet from one end to the other.
About 100 feet?
I don't know.
Yeah,
But it'll be pretty easy.
Roughly.
If you take
I'm seeing 850, as high as 850 and as small as
that pond's down there like an 860.
866,
Yeah.
yeah,
So-
870, I'm sorry, 770, 760.
So
So
90?
100 feet.
So less than 100. Okay.
Right.
That was my own information, but yeah, I do like the way it's laid out in the front. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Blake.
You bet.
Do we have a report from the planner?
Mr. Chair and members of the commission, they are asking for approval of a preliminary plat. The proposal is consistent with the guiding and the zoning of the property. They're not asking for any waivers. And Mr. Blake is correct. It is a unique site. It's wooded. There are steep slopes and a bluff in the southwest corner. There's the potential for archaeological resources on and near the property, given its proximity to the river. He mentioned the old foundation that is potentially the remnant of an old blacksmith shop, but that has not been confirmed yet. And the private driveways that go through Lot 1 with easements is a little bit different than a typical situation. And there are a number of conditions of approval because of how these lots may be sold. We had to really think through when certain things would happen and who would be responsible for those improvements and securities, et cetera. And staff is recommending approval, subject to the conditions of approval in your staff report.
Great, thank you. Any question for the planner? All right, this is an open hearing. If anyone would like to come and speak for or against this project, please step forward. Please step forward. Good evening. If you could state your name and spell it, please, for the record.
Schnelly, S-C-H-N-E, B as in boy, E-L-E.
Good evening.
I'm a little bit concerned from the standpoint that, number one, I
Excuse me, could you speak just a little closer? We're having trouble hearing you.
never received any neighborhood meeting letter, so I thought that was an interesting comment. And I do recall that the property was looking to be developed, boy, easily 10 years ago, I may be off on that. It was like 10 or 12 homes that were being proposed in this lot. And I do remember speaking to one of the inspectors from Eden Prairie who said that they couldn't do it because of the issues with the runoff and the sloping, and that they probably would never do any building back there as a result of that. And now all of a sudden it seems like it's being approved. So it just, and I don't mean to go against Greg. And, I mean, they've been great neighbors, but it's a definite concern from our perspective, especially when I see a driveway too that's going to be, looks like literally right up against our fence.
I'm sorry, you're on the north side of the property on Riverview Road?
Yes, yes. Would be lot 3 we butt up against.
Great. We'll have someone address your
And then
concerns.
I missed the comment about a 2-year time frame from Mr. Blake. I wasn't sure what he was saying there. Is a 2-year time frame that had this all developed? Was that the comment?
We'll bring him back forward and ask
Okay.
him to address your concerns.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Blake, could you come?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, the 2 years I was referring to is my understanding in the city code that the final plat has to happen within 2 years of the preliminary plat or it would expire. And I just said I couldn't imagine that a final plat wouldn't happen with, in less than that 2-year time frame. I just couldn't. It might not be the normal where it comes back 1 month later with a final plat.
And then, I'm not sure who could speak to this. Were you familiar with this proposal of some years ago to build 10 to 12 homes?
I've seen a lot of different sketches or drawings that were done before. I showed you my 5 concepts. I didn't show you the other ones. I didn't know what, they're right. Again, if you took a normal 4.4 acre site, excuse me, at 2.5 units per acre, that would get you 11 lots, which is pretty typical Eden Prairie density. So if someone had a concept of 10 or something like that, it wouldn't, you could draw it on there. It would require a lot of retaining walls and things like that to build.
And then lastly, you did send out notices for the meeting?
I could check our records. We get our mailing list from the city. We use the same labels that they use to send out to this meeting. So if there wasn't a change in ownership, I'm a little surprised that something didn't happen, because I know that the neighbors on either side, because I talked to a couple of the neighbors on Riverview Road, but received the letter. But
Thank you. Any follow-up questions from the commission?
I have a question about the engineering to protect the bluff and any potential erosion. Given we live in an era of climate change with sudden heavy downpours, we're getting them more frequently. From an engineering standpoint, how would you protect the soil from large-scale movement in the event of a 2 to 3 inch or more rain event?
Is that something the city wants to address, or Mr. Blake?
yeah, I'm not going to give you a great answer. Excuse me.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I don't have a specific answer. The 2 pieces I will tell you is that's why there's 2 new homes proposed and not 6 or 7 or 8, because we are preserving as much of the natural vegetation as made sense. We're trying to touch as much of the land, a balance. Let's get some use out of this, and a good use. Secondly, as I mentioned, a staff condition is a land alteration permit and a steep slope permit for each home that gets built, which is not a normal, that's a way above and beyond a building permit requirement. So we'll go back through engineering department, and they will ask those very questions that you did. What gets built to make sure that during construction and after construction, we're not increasing a risk of something.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps the city engineer could just comment on your perception. You've obviously looked at these drawings and all, and maybe give us a little view from your perspective on, the risk of steep slope and construction, and the kind of precautions that you might require for that.
Certainly. Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, as indicated by Mr. Blake, there would be a steep slope permit as well as a land alteration permit, and that steep slope permit requires a much higher level of evaluation, particularly geotechnical evaluation of how you would build this on these slopes, and there would just be a lot more engineering involved, particularly on the soil side.
If I may follow up on that quickly, where is the delineation boundaries of the steep slopes? I mean, is it the entire 100% of all three of these lots, or is there, because I see the 30-foot bluff setback, and then there was a note in the staff report that is modified. Looks like that was cut back, and I had a question about that as well. Maybe kill two birds with one stone here, but where does the steep slope actually begin and end?
Well, according to our city code, anything over 12% is considered a steep slope, which is pretty much the entire site, and probably most of Eden Prairie is 12%. But in this case, there's bluff determination on this one, and a bluff is, again, more difficult to interpret. It's generally an average of over 30% grade, and it has to be a height of about 25 feet or more, or 25 feet or more, not about. It's generally consistent with a shoreline zone. But there are, 30% slopes in a lot of places. It's just that there's a higher standard when you're in a shoreland area. And the technology today allows us to determine bluffs by computer than it was years ago. It was very difficult to interpret where it was or where it ended. It basically is a 30% grade until it reaches a point where it averages at least 18% for 50 feet. And most of those are standards that are developed by the DNR and the state. So it's rather easy to have a standard. It's difficult to interpret the standard.
So what is the red notation that was in the, could someone speak to that briefly? In the steep slopes and bluff, there was some red lining or some red notations on changes, and that was one of the conditions of the, I can't remember, one of the conditions of approval, staff recommendation approval was revised bluff impact zone and bluff setback preliminary plat indicated in drawing that city proposed or provided. Could you speak to that, or somebody?
Yes, I believe Beth, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the drawing that was submitted was not, the bluff area was not shown correctly. But then on top of that, so the drawings need to be adjusted to show the bluff area accurately. And then there's also, as part of that bluff, wherever that line is determined as the top of the bluff, then there's a bluff impact zone and a bluff setback zone. In this case, the home isn't anywhere near that setback, but it's basically an area it's untouched.
And that's what was the conservation easement spoke of earlier?
Correctly, yes.
Mr. Chairman? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to supplement his answer. I believe that the bluff impact is just an upland impact, and I think that was the red line that you're speaking about, is that on the preliminary plat, it infers that the bluff setback and the impact encircles the bluff, both uphill and downhill and to the side. And I think the comment that was in the staff report that was redlined was that bluffs are only impacted from uphill forces, and therefore the lines aren't necessary at the bottom of the bluff. So again, I apologize for interrupting. I just wanted to put a tail onto staff's comment there.
Yeah, thank you.
Uphill nature of the impact.
Any other questions or comments from the commission?
I do, but it's more overarching concern. But I'll defer until someone else. Other people.
I guess I have a comment. It seems like it seems like the city staff has done a good job here of putting fairly stringent requirements, and the developer and the owner have designed the placement of the house pads and all such that they're pretty far away from any areas that would have potential significant impacts. So to me, it looks like staff has done a good job of adding a lot of the criteria by which we are going to protect the bluffs and we are going to protect the area. And as the developer said, also allow some nice usage of this, very desirable property. So I'm sounding like I think staff's done their homework, and I'm supportive of their efforts to protect the bluff area.
And the project itself?
And the project itself, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I have a few technical questions
Yes.
Of staff. Could we start with a staff's commentary on the Riverview Road right-of-way? Whether or not, I have a question of whether that should be vacated or not. The story that was in the staff report, I believe, is that the road was originally there, and as evidenced by the historical photography that was offered to us, and then it was abandoned because of maybe some washouts or something like that, but it remains a city-owned right-of-way. And the single property owner seems to be maintaining the driveway down through the public right-of-way and into his lot. Is there a reason why, at this point in time, we would want to clean that up and turn that over from city property to private property? And maybe if not, why not? I understand there's a storm sewer running down there, but maybe that could be protected by a utility easement in lieu of property rights. And then as follow-up to that, also on the preliminary plat, they're calling the driveway easement to lots 3 and 2 just that, driveway easements, and there's no connecting the dots of the utilities from the public road to each one of those home sites. And the D&U dimensions around lot 2 and 3 are variable, 10-foot, 20-foot, 30-foot D&Us. And I'm wondering why the variety of the D&Us on the preliminary plat, and if that was because of some anticipated routing of utilities that caused a hardship or some other thought process.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, a lot of questions there.
Sorry.
Regarding Riverview Road, we do have access. We do need access down to the river bottom. We've got some facilities down there, not only the storm sewer, but we also have some area that we're maintaining, ponding and other areas down by that washout, which you're referring to. How that right-of-way ever got established was probably because that road has been there for 100 years. So I don't know who you'd ever vacate it to. So you'd have to probably sell it, and we're not vacating that right-of-way. I think would be troublesome from our perspective. We don't like to give up right-of-way if we don't have to, based on the cost when we try to buy it. So we have it and we need it, and so we'd like to maintain it. Regarding the comment about the driveway easement, I think that was a note in the staff report about they needed to address that prior to council to show that that's a private driveway and utility easement, that 50-foot. So that's an error in on their drawing. Regarding the perimeter easements, I think they're fairly consistent. You might be confusing it a little bit with some of the setback lines. I think there's a 10-foot utility easement along the perimeter of the road, and a 5-foot on the other side lots. Although there appears to be a little wider one on the west side of lots 1 and 2. And then obviously down by the bottom, the southerly tip of the project, there's a larger drainage utility easement and conservation easement for the bluff area and the future stormwater facility. Otherwise, I think the perimeter ones are intended to be fairly consistent with our standards.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Blake, did you have something to add?
I can give a quick point of clarification. I don't know that it'll add much to what your city engineer just told you. The reason those normal utility easements are a little confusing, good way to look at it is that sort of triangular shaped lot. Where's the front? Where's the back? What are the sides? So we kind of erred and called things rears when they maybe are really sides. It's a little bit fuzzy. So, you know, this is the case where those drainage and utility easements along those property lines probably never become anything. The intent for the utilities, the sewer and water to serve the individual lots would be they would parallel the driveways. And that's probably how, like, your electric and cable TV would go as well. But those aren't, they serve one lot at a time. There won't be any infrastructure out there that's cutting across to get to somebody else, which is really what typical public drainage and utility easements are. So we'll have the typical public that are mandated by code, rears, sides, all that, which I would guess won't ever get used for anything. But then we'll have private easements for the services to the individual lots that cross lots. So there is, and then there's setback lines shown on there too, which adds to the confusion in the drawing. But
Thank you.
that sense?
Commissioner Farber.
I have a question for staff, if I could, please. Previously, before sitting on the Planning Commission, I sat on the Heritage Preservation Commission. And I know this is a hot button with her right now, is this town site of Hennepin. A couple things come to mind. Right now, I noticed that they've submitted a grant application and request for proposals for a phase-run survey of several sites south of the property itself. I know it's hard to tell when grants come in. I understand that totally. One thing I'm wondering about is, first off, I do like the ideas, the condition that you have in for someone from the Office of the State Archaeologist and the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council on site and grading, because burial mounds are always going to be of issue along the river there. But this town site of Hennepin, while I do like how far it's set back from the bluff areas itself, what if something is found down there that is of significance? Just a red flag in my head. I know there's nothing that, on the surface at this point itself, but I've seen the plans, the original plans for the home site, the town site of Hennepin. It's real. There's no doubt about it. It was all platted out at one time. And if something comes up that's significant, during this survey, how is this going to impact what you're trying to do? And I know, Mr. Blake, that's not something you can answer. That's why I'm directing it to staff.
Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, if this is determined to be significant, I think what it would impact perhaps is the grading for that stormwater management facility. We may have to make special provisions for protecting that foundation or anything else while they're doing some of that grading work for the stormwater facility.
Okay, then staff is prepared to do that as it comes up then.
Yes, as part of the land alteration permit. The stormwater management facility may not be installed immediately.
Okay.
I think the phasing, I think the idea is for Lot 3, which is on the west side, to be developed first. And then it is not until the home on Lot 2 is constructed that stormwater facility has to be installed. So there's some time for us to determine what it is that's down there and whether it's significant.
Well, thank you. That's what I was anticipating. There is a time factor here, and things always seem to work out in a time factor, and it seems like a good contingency. Thank you very much.
Comments from the commission or concerns or? Commissioner
I'll just echo what the Commissioner just said, Commissioner Freiberg. We had looked at this back when I was on the Heritage Preservation Commission too, but I'm not convinced at this moment, but I could be later, just as your staff was just saying, that there is some element of that Hennepin Town site that may appear where we don't expect it. That's the biggest question, because I don't think the mapping that we've got, that I've ever seen, tells me enough about whether we're close or not. The river's changed, the bluff has changed. It was a long time ago. I would love to find something, just being a history buff, but on the other hand, if we find something, I think it's going to be relatively incomplete, and we may not have something that's of significance. But on the other hand, we're taking note of it tonight. Hopefully, we just make note of it. I think the way they planned out the first house to go up, hopefully will give us some demonstration of things that we may need to do going further toward a third home development. But we've got more time because of the way they've planned it this far. So I'm generally supportive of what's being proposed.
Just follow up to this conversation, being a little naive on the historical nature of this. I've heard this home called historical in, I believe, if not the staff report, the project narrative by the applicant. Is there any inference that it has special historical protection? I didn't think so. Thank you. But in follow-up, just also to make sure, is there any duty to search for historical remnants while a site is being developed when there is probable cause of their of that possibility? Or are you just saying if they stumble across it, then? I'm not exactly sure what the historical rules are on that.
Your point is well taken, and I don't know for certain, and I don't know if Commissioner Freiberg knows more basically than what I attempted to understand when I was on the commission, which was the thought was that a lot of where the land was platted and then abandoned was in the river valley, so much that the river flows and the flooding over the years had pretty much destroyed all but a very small portion of what could be ascertained as remnants of that area that was hoped to become a city on the river and to be a mercantile area for this part of the state. But that never happened. So I never came away with a certainty that we would have, as we do in some other places in the city, a process that can be well-defined, and you know right away that there are some things that are probably still to be addressed, even though we don't know what they are yet. I think they did a lot of work, but there was a lot of determination over years of staff effort that it wasn't something that was of high priority, because the view was that very little remained over those years because of the effect of water and the sandy area too, just the erosion and all of that. But I think that's the point. You start digging, but you're up high, and so I'm not anticipating anything. But maybe it's worth checking with the History Center on some of this. But at this point in the whole development process, that doesn't seem to be, I don't think of anything being really obvious that there should be something addressed at this moment.
I totally concur with that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, could I comment? I mean, it seems to me that under the conditions for the land alteration permit, it says during construction of the stormwater management facility infrastructure, additional precautions may be necessary to protect potential historic foundation as determined by the city. So I think we've got the protections written into the agreement to look for and be careful about that. And the developer has said he agrees with those. So I think, again, it sounds like the homework's been done from my perspective.
Right. I think so.
Good point, thank you. Commissioner Wookie, did you?
Maybe I'll save it for members' report.
Okay. All right, any other concerns or comments or from the commission? I, for one, I think the homework has been done. I think this is a pretty good plan. I'm supportive of it to move forward, so. Does anyone want to make a motion?
Mr. Chairman, move to close the public hearing.
Do you have a second?
A second.
All those in favor of closing the public hearing, say aye.
Aye.
Hearing's closed.
Mr. Chairman, move to recommend approval of the preliminary plat of one lot into 3 lots on 4.46 acres based on information outlined in the staff report dated May 4th, 2017, and the plan stamp dated April 27th, 2017.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Project passes. Good luck. Thank you. All right, moving on. Next agenda. Do we have any planners' reports this evening? Do we have any members' reports this evening?
It's just something that I noticed, and not really familiar with the history of this as they were when they brought forward the project, but just noticing that there wasn't a lot of deviations. In fact, there were no deviations from the code, yet I saw or counted 23 bullet points of staff recommendations for change, and I'm a little concerned as to, although the staff was being very thorough in their due diligence, concerning of overreach perhaps on that side. It's just an observation. It had nothing to do with the project or anything like that, and I'm just thinking forward with the comprehensive guide plan changes and what could potentially be a more streamlined administrative approval process on straight zoning, asking for nothing, kind of deal. This is a good example of how things could be accomplished internally.
You know, if I could just address something, Commissioner Wecky. Normally, you and I totally agree as far as the overreach on it. I get concerned too on that. The way I read this, I think this was intentional for this particular situation. I think a lot had to do with what I brought up about, you know, the historical, potential historical significance and, you know, and erosions. And that's kind of where I came away from it, is that it was, in this particular case, it was just a cautious approach, because normally I do get concerned with that also.
And I would tend to agree with you. There are outliers on this particular project that necessitated a heavier scrutiny. And so I agree that staff was
Especially if some past
doing their due
history on this.
diligence appropriately and stuff like that. In so fact, on the Office of the State Archaeologist, there was a memo that was part of the staff report.
Right.
And even though the OSA had their shot at looking at and doing their due diligence, we're putting a condition that they get another chance at bat, and that is a concern.
Well, and I would say that, given the chaos of actual construction and excavation, that there should be a preliminary review of the site by OSA or the Indian Council prior to any actual shovel activity.
Just a comment, I think it's a point that we should consider. I happen to not believe there's overreach in this case because of the multiple sensitivities. But on the other hand, I think that's a question we always need to be asking, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Great. Okay. Any other members' reports this evening? Continuing business, new business. Entertain a motion to close the meeting.
I make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second.
Second.
All those in favor to close the meeting, say aye. Aye. Meeting's closed.
It's interesting.
you have a lot more experience with historical preservation.
There was,
I'm more concerned about the burial mounds than I am about the foundation. And I agree with your point. It's a fragmentary foundation at best, probably of little residual salvageable value historical. But I'm more concerned about the burial mounds and artifacts that are buried